All right, in this video, we are going to talk a little bit about the concepts that you want to be thinking about as you approach this project. And I'm going to work through a few sample projects and talk about what works and what might not be working. For the most part, these sample projects are actually well done, but in that view, we'll see why they're well done and what works. Um, so, getting started, we have the what is art concept. So, remembering from what I said in the book, every word in this phrase could be important. What is art? What is art? Or what is art? It also has an exclamation point. I mean, a question mark that allows a potential opportunity for graphic enhancement. So as this person is playing around with the different possibilities, and here is an example where a background might be appropriate, and adding a little bit of color is also appropriate. And playing around with it with that little dot, it's kind of a bit of an anomaly, and that's kind of fun. Playing around a little bit with typeface. And it's good to just get started by playing around with one typeface and just exploring the configuration. Where do the words go, and what order are they in? Do they overlap or not? Um, how tight is the spacing between the words or even between the letters? So these are all questions you want to ask yourself. So that's why it's a good idea to start with a single typeface first rather than exploring a whole bunch of typefaces randomly. It can create a little bit of confusion, and then you can add a typeface carefully. It's like working with color and working with a monochromatic solution. You're dealing only with one color, and then as you get to the point where you're happy with that experiment, then you could add a second color. Same thing with type. You work with one typeface and then you explore another one, right? So here she's mostly experimenting with color, which is a good which is, I should say, another good way of exploring the question, right? What are we talking about here? Now, playing around a little bit with the question mark as a graphic enhancement, exploring color. Is this enough color? Is this too much color? One of the things when we use color, as we learned in the color project, that you can use a highlight color really carefully, and it acts like a bullseye no matter where it is in the composition, right? So here, kind of backing off a little bit, and then all of a sudden that orange makes a lot more sense, right? Here's an interesting just experiment in playing around with repetition and similarity. And it's fine. I have no issues with pushing things around. Exploring some graphic enhancement there. Exploring now in a different path using a color field in a different typeface. Just sort of exploring these very small but sometimes very effective changes in typeface or position. Now this is a completely different approach. And, here, very strong contrast, right? A simple, clean sans serif with a very elaborate architectural type of Gothic type font. So, again, if you think about your contrast carefully, in this one, right, a little too much going on. These are those graphic enhancements that I was talking about in the previous video, where, if you're going to add something, it needs to add to the composition or to the message. And in this case, it's definitely detracting, right? It's just too much going on. It definitely takes away from the actual impact of the message itself. But playing with the sense of contrast, one typeface carefully used, contrasting with a more dramatic typeface. And so this is a good little experiment, just all uppercase, lowercase, nice typeface contrast. Here is a good example where a sans serif and a serif typeface contrast nicely. Again, sort of playing around a little bit with the color. So the orange is introduced and then it finishes it off with a period. So that's a good experiment. And then you're going with lowercase. So a simple change in the case of the typeface can also make an interesting contrast. So again, using color carefully, getting rid of the background. Again, this is a situation where I feel a background color is a useful tool, right? Or is a useful experiment, at least. Seeing this solution is not bad, right? But having that background with the white confidence word really creates a lot more drama and impact, right? Here exploring the same solution with a different typeface. And again, that's the same idea. If you like something that you're working with, then don't change that and add a typeface only, and a typeface change. Going back to the idea of a background change, a little bit of color, outlines, lowercase, a little change in typeface, a little bit of contrast. This is a flare serif typeface with a rather bold, condensed typeface. So these, again, just exploring that whole idea of contrast. And then if you like something that you have created with different typefaces and or colors and or sizes and or upper lowercase or whatever, then you explore different configurations. You don't have to just keep changing everything, right? You explore scale changes, boldness changes, minor variations in a theme with the addition of the period, color change. Again, now going with the lowercase same typeface. And these aren't huge changes, right? But they are effective studies. And that's one of the things that I really want you to think about, is that you don't have to go completely wacky wild with wild and crazy typefaces. Now, I don't mind that you explore them, but the problem with them is that it can get out of control. And so by exploring with traditional typefaces first, you definitely have the opportunity to explore the sense of type as opposed to the sense of, display, if you will. Word spacing. This is a good example where often very tight word spacing will work and create a very strong sense of continuity within a structural configuration of your type. As you begin to explore spacing between words, we get into the issue of gravity. And we haven't discussed gravity at great length, and it's one of the concepts that I introduce at the end of chapter 2. But if we explore the concept of gravity, okay, so confidence is the word that has the most gravity, right? It's the largest word. It's a heavy, actually, it's a black typeface, and so it's going to be able to hold down a little bit of weight. And so as these words start to float away from that, how far can they get before they start to lose it, right? So if we take a look at this, for example, and just sort of scale this stuff down, as we think about how far things can go away before they start to float, it's like, at what point does the gravity of the primary dominant element stop being able to influence the relationships between the elements? And this is a very touchy relationship. As the word starts to go away, it starts to become disjointed, right? And so it's really important to understand how far away you can get before it starts to float away. And so that's a relationship that you can explore using the up and down arrows on your keyboard. And if you just do that, you can kind of go, how far away is that going to work before it starts to, come apart? And this is something that happens a lot in early designers' exploration with type, is the feeling of too much space and not enough gravity. So those are things that you want to think about as you explore these different types of relationships. Okay, so trying to like what happens here. Suddenly the by with is starting to become a separate entity because of that in a rectangle that was added. This kind of tightens it up a little bit. This tightens it up a bit more. So these are all really valid, very valid studies. So in the Keep Walking department, here again you're kind of exploring the same typeface, but this is a phrase that really invites a different contrasting typeface, and this really works well. The idea of a very kind of playful, sort of drawn typeface with a very, again, a playful but very more type calligraphic type of face. And this works nicely, good contrast between bold and light, and then of course the color. Now just sort of playing around with different slight variations on, where things are and what typefaces they use. And another thing, as we start to explore this a little further, is looking at a given typeface with the individual letter forms. Sometimes you'll find that a typeface and the way the letters are, the given letters in your word just look weird, and it's just because the typeface, and those letter forms in that word just don't work well. So it's important to recognize when you think you got this awesome typeface and then you put it in the word you want to use, it's like, huh? What's up with that? So keep that in mind as you start to explore these a bit further. In the end, this one of these two is probably the winner. And in my eye, this one is more the winner because it has a nice sense of contrast. Even though the typeface is the same, it's handled differently. There's a contrast in the grade of the white, contrast in size, and the very, very tall ascenders on the L and the K create some drama and also help it to tie with the P and the K. So it's a nice solution. Speaking of solutions, there's a concept called kerning. And kerning is essentially the spacing between two letters, okay? So as we look at the spacing here, this is probably our benchmark, our guide. So everything should look like it's balanced at this particular point. But if we look at the K and the I, notice how its spacing looks a little bit weird. And this is a default issue. In other words, how the typeface is designed and how much space the designer gave around every individual letter. So we have some issues with this typeface. We have the W and the A, which looks a little too far away, the K and the I, which definitely looks too far away, and the N and the G, which look too far away. So you would use your kerning tool by placing your cursor in between the two letters and then using the kerning tool to tighten up that individual letter spacing between those two letters. Okay, so that's something to think about. So now we got the shameless pleasure, and there's a good sense of contrast between the two words. Nice graphic enhancement, nice contrast between the two typefaces. Probably the embellishment on pleasure actually probably works better than without it, right? Just gives it a little bit more contrast. Some interesting background color changes, typeface changes. So this one ended up probably not being that successful overall. If in the end it's probably, either this one possibly that one, so you're really kind of looking for what happens best. And this is another reason to save incrementally, right? Because you might say, okay, well, I've gotten to this point and I'm going to keep pushing it. You keep pushing it. And then you end up, here somewhere and you realize, I just mucked it up. But if you didn't save the one further back, then you don't have that to work on. And so now you're going, now what typeface was that? And what did I do with the effect on pleasure and so on? So important to save incrementally. It's a good example. Here's another phrase where every word is potentially the most dominant word. So what were you thinking? And again, just playing around with different typefaces. And so, picking up on a different typeface, then all of a sudden, you're on a different route. And here we are thinking about the U, the R, right? The question mark as a graphic enhancement, a little bit of letter and line spacing, some overlap, a different type solution for R. So maybe that R was a little too dominant, right? Sometimes you don't need big black to make something important. Sometimes simply making things smaller or picking a typeface that has a more dramatic style to it, and playing around with configuration, adding a little bit of color to kind of give it a little bit of, what are you thinking, right? So this is a fun sort of exploration in the ambiguity of what word is the most important. So that's kind of cool. Also, picking up a different typeface for the question mark can create a little bit of drama as well. So those are some things that you can think about. Again, if you think you've pushed it far enough, then explore a different typeface, but maybe only one. Maybe the what are you part is, got the right typefaces, or you don't need so many typefaces. This is kind of a fun little configuration. And again, this would only happen with the typeface that had, a lower loop of the G that did that, and you could play around with that question mark inside of it. So that's kind of clever. But again, the individual typefaces are what are going to give you those opportunities. So those are some things to think about. Okay, so these are all really excellent studies, and consider that the type solutions are in general rather tight. You'll find that you have the best success with your messages. It's not the only way, but you'll have the best chance for success if you consider tight type configurations in this project. Okay, so these are things you want to think about as you are thinking about what are you thinking. All right, so that is our exercise in design concepts. Enjoy.